The summer Garrett Brixton turned 44, he stopped counting the miles. Not because he had lost track of them, but because counting implied that the distance meant something, that arriving somewhere was different from leaving somewhere else. And Garrett had spent 3 years learning that those two things were exactly the same. You left, you arrived. The road between them was just noise and heat, and the vibration of engine metal against your bones. A frequency so constant that your body eventually stopped registering it as sensation and started accepting it as silence. He had loaded his saddlebag on a Thursday morning in Knoxville, Tennessee, before the sun cleared the ridgeline behind his property. The air at that hour still carried the faint coolness of night, the kind that would be gone by 8 and forgotten by 9, burned off by an August that had decided to make a point. He had checked the oil, checked the tire pressure, checked the chain tension with the automatic efficiency of a man who had been doing the same things in the same order for 15 years. His hands knew the routine so well they could perform it, while the rest of him was somewhere else entirely. And the rest of him that morning, as on most mornings, was in a hospital room in Knoxville, 3 years back and 3 floors up, and completely unreachable no matter how many miles he put between himself and the memory. Caleb had been 8 years old. Dark-haired like Garrett, with the same tendency to go quiet when something interested him, the same habit of watching a thing from 3 different angles before deciding what it was. He had loved engines with the focused devotion that some children reserve for sports or comic books, or the obsessions of childhood that adults smiled at and forgot. He could identify a Harley by sound before it came around the corner. He knew the difference between a flathead and a knucklehead by the shape of the engine cases. He had learned these things sitting on an overturned bucket in Garrett's garage in the evenings, asking questions that Garrett answered one by one carefully, the way you answer questions from someone whose curiosity you respect. The accident happened on a Saturday in November. Garrett had been at the shop finishing a transmission rebuild that had taken 3 days longer than it should have. His ex-wife Dana had Caleb for the weekend. The roads were dry, the weather was clear. None of the conditions that people usually blame for what happened were present that afternoon. What was present was Dana's blood alcohol level, which the hospital later recorded at .17, and a guardrail on Merchants Drive that the car hit at 42 miles per hour after drifting across the center line on a gentle curve that Garrett himself had driven 1,000 times without incident. Dana survived with a broken collarbone and a fractured wrist, in a case that the district attorney eventually reduced to a misdemeanor because of circumstances that Garrett's lawyer had explained to him in careful legal language, that he had heard and not heard simultaneously, the words landing on his ears, but never reaching the part of his brain that processed meaning, because the part of his brain that processed meaning had been offline since the phone call. Caleb did not survive. The dates were on Garrett's right wrist, just below the edge of his sleeve. Small numbers in a plain black font. Nothing decorative, nothing that drew attention. 8 years between the first date and the second. 8 years that Garrett had been present for almost every day of 8 years of questions answered and voices imitated during bedtime reading and engine sounds identified from around corners, compressed now into 2 lines of ink that he could cover with his thumb. He covered them now with his thumb as he pulled out of the driveway and pointed the bike north. 900 miles, Sturgis, South Dakota. Cal Merritt had called the meeting 3 weeks earlier, the full chapter assembled in the back room of Ridgeline Bar on the east side of Knoxville. Cal was 56 years old, built like a man who had spent his working life outdoors, with silver hair cropped close to his skull, and a face that looked like it had been weathered by decades of deliberate exposure to difficult conditions. He had been president of the Iron Wolves MC for 14 years, and in that time he had developed the quality of authority that comes not from aggression, but from consistency. You always knew where Cal stood. You always knew what he would do. In a world that offered very little certainty, that reliability was worth more than most people understood. The Iron Wolves were not the Hells Angels. They were not the outlaws. They occupied a different space in the landscape of American motorcycle culture. Men who had come to the road from various directions. Veterans, tradesmen, working men, who had found in the Brotherhood something that civilian life had not provided: a structure, a code, a set of obligations that meant something because they were chosen rather than assigned. They rode clean. They did not deal. They had their history and their complications, as any group of men who had lived hard lives inevitably did. But Cal had spent 14 years steering the chapter towards something he called standing, which meant being the kind of men that a community trusted rather than feared. 280 members. The full chapter at Sturgis was a statement of unity, Cal had explained. A reminder that the Iron Wolves were intact, that the bonds held, that the miles between members were temporary conditions rather than permanent separations. Garrett had nodded and packed his bag and not mentioned that unity was an abstract concept that currently held very little weight for him, because the only bond that had ever mattered to him in a bone-deep way had been severed 3 years ago on a dry Saturday in November, and no amount of chrome or brotherhood had managed to close the gap it left behind. He rode alone, which was unusual for a chapter run, but not unprecedented. He had left a day early, citing shop business that needed handling before he could get away, which was partially true, and mostly a way of buying himself 9 hours on the road without conversation. He needed the noise of the engine and the wind and the emptiness of highway miles to perform the compression that always happened before he arrived anywhere. The taking of everything that lived in his chest and pressing it down into something smaller and denser and more manageable, a stone instead of a flood, something that could be carried without spilling. By the time he crossed into South Dakota, the compression was complete. He arrived in Sturgis on a Friday evening and found the town already transformed into the temporary nation it became every August. 70,000 people where 7,000 usually lived. The streets thickened with leather and denim, and the smell of engine oil and food vendor smoke, and the underlying salt of human beings in concentrated summer heat. The rally had been happening since 1938, and it had long since developed its own gravity, pulling riders from every state and several countries into this corner of the Black Hills every August with the reliable force of tradition. Garrett found the motel where the chapter had reserved rooms, checked in, dropped his bag, and walked back out into the evening without unpacking. He was not ready to be inside four walls yet. He needed to decompress from the compression, which was its own process, slower and less predictable than the first one. He found a wooden bench outside the Iron Saddle Saloon on Main Street and sat on the edge of it with his elbows on his knees and a bottle of water sweating between his hands. The temperature had dropped to 91, but the heat still pressed down on the street with physical weight bending the air above the asphalt into shimmering distortions that made the crowd beyond 20 feet look like a painting that had been left in the rain. He watched the crowd with the detached patience he had developed in the Marines, the ability to observe a complex environment without being absorbed by it, to track movement and pattern and anomaly without committing emotionally to any of it. He had served 2 tours, the first in his 20s before Caleb was born, the second in his 30s when Caleb was 4, and old enough to know that his father was gone, and young enough not to understand fully what that meant. Garrett had come back both times. He had come back carrying things that he managed through the same mechanism he managed everything else. Compression, reduction, the conversion of floods into stones. The crowd moved through the street in its Saturday afternoon rhythm. Families, vendors, photographers crouching beside custom paint jobs. A group of older men comparing tattoos outside the saloon with the serious attention that older men brought to such comparisons. Somewhere behind Garrett inside the bar, someone was playing Lynyrd Skynyrd through speakers that were no longer entirely equal to the task. The guitar coming through clearly, but the low end muddied into something that vibrated more than it sang. Garrett drank his water and watched and let the afternoon move around him. It was the movement that caught his attention first. Not the content of it, not the details, but the quality. Among the crowd, which moved with the rhythm of people who were somewhere voluntarily, who were enjoying themselves, who had nowhere specific to be, and were experiencing that freedom as pleasure, there was a movement that did not fit. A shape threading through the crowd in the wrong direction, not against it exactly, but without relation to it. Moving through the gaps between people, the way water moved through cracks in pavement, not choosing a path so much as following the path of least resistance. He straightened on the bench. The shape was small. He registered that first. Small and low moving between the bodies of adults who did not notice it because they were looking at each other at vendors at the bikes parked along the street in their gleaming rows, not at what was happening at knee level. She was 15 feet away when he understood what he was looking at. A girl, 7 years old perhaps, though the thinness of her made age difficult to read. She wore a dress that had once been yellow. The color faded now to something closer to cream, the fabric stained at the hem with brown that might have been mud and might have been something else. Her hair was light brown and matted close to her scalp, the kind of tangle that came from weeks rather than days of inattention. Her arms, visible below the short sleeves of the dress, were thin in the way that registered before you understood why it registered. Not the thinness of a child who had grown fast and not yet filled in. A different kind of thinness, the kind that spoke of systematic absence. She was walking without shoes. The asphalt was 103 degrees. It had been at or above that temperature since 10 in the morning. Garrett knew this because he had checked his phone thermometer twice in the afternoon, out of the habit of a man who paid attention to the conditions he was operating in. The pavement under this girl's bare feet had been cooking for 7 hours. She was 10 feet away, and her steps were uneven, the weight shifting slightly with each one, her body making the small continuous adjustments of someone walking on a surface that was hurting them, but moving forward anyway, because stopping was a worse option than continuing. Her eyes were open. They were aimed generally forward, but focused on nothing in the immediate environment. She was looking at something beyond the crowd, beyond the street, beyond Sturgis, South Dakota, beyond anything that existed in the physical space she was moving through. 7 feet. Garrett stood up. 5 feet. Her knees buckled. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the slow, incremental way of a structure that had been under load too long, the joints giving out in sequence, a downward progression that her body was too depleted to interrupt. 3 feet. She went forward. Garrett was already moving. He covered the distance without thinking about it, without the mental step of deciding to move, and then moving the way the body operated in the moment before the conscious mind finished its deliberations. His hands found her shoulders. He turned her as she fell, guiding the collapse, so that she came down onto his arms rather than the pavement, catching her weight, which was almost nothing. Which was the first thing about her that reached through the compression he maintained and touched something that lived below it. She weighed almost nothing. He lowered himself to his knees on the hot asphalt, cradling her against him. Her skin was hot. Not the external heat of a child who had been in the sun, but the internal heat of a fever. Her lips were pale and cracked. Her eyes were closed now, or nearly closed, the lids not quite meeting a sliver of gray-blue iris visible beneath the lashes. "Hey," Garrett said. His voice came out low and controlled the voice he used in situations where controlling his voice was necessary. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her lips moved. A sound came out that was not a word. It was the sound an animal makes when it has stopped expecting rescue, when the noise it produces is no longer a signal directed at anything external, but simply the last audible expression of something that is still barely alive. The crowd around him had begun to notice. He could hear it, the shift in the ambient noise, conversations tapering off, a ring of attention forming around the space he occupied. He was aware of it without being distracted by it, the way he was aware of peripheral things in the field present in his perception, but not commanding it. "Give her some room." This was Boone Draper's voice coming from somewhere above and behind him. Boone was 38, 6'2", with a shaved head, and the kind of physical presence that communicated without requiring words. Garrett heard the crowd shift back. He heard Boone's phone come out, heard the terse, efficient speech of someone calling 911. Cal Merritt arrived 30 seconds later. Garrett heard the silence that formed around Cal when he moved through a group, the way men made room, not because they were told to, but because something in them recognized that a situation had found its authority. Cal crouched beside Garrett and looked at the girl with the focused assessment of a man who had been reading difficult situations for 50 years. "Whose child is this?" Cal asked. Nobody answered. Vera Hutchins pushed through the outer ring of people with the purposefulness of someone who has a skill the moment requires. She was 41, compact and direct, a registered nurse from Rapid City who attended the rally every year. She knelt on the other side of the girl and pressed two fingers to her neck, counting silently, her eyes moving across the child's visible condition with professional speed. Pulses rapid, weak. She placed the back of her hand against the girl's forehead. She's running a fever, high. She's severely dehydrated. She looked up at Garrett briefly, then back down. How long do you think she was walking? I don't know. I just saw her come through the crowd. Vera reached for the edge of the girl's sleeve. She lifted it carefully, only far enough to see what was underneath. Then she stopped. Her hands went still. The expression on her face changed in the way that a composed professional's expression changes when they encounter something the professional composure was not designed to absorb. She looked at Cal. Cal looked at what was under the sleeve. The ring of people around them had grown. Iron Wolves patches were visible throughout it. Men who had come from the saloon and the street, and the vendor rows drawn by the gravity of an event that was larger than a medical emergency. They stood with their backs to the inner circle and their eyes scanning outward, the formation so natural that it had not been ordered. It had simply happened because the instinct had been trained into them by years of operating as a coherent body. The bruises ran from the girl's shoulder blade down across her ribs and disappeared beneath the fabric of the dress. They were not the scattered accidental bruises of childhood, the shin bangs and elbow scrapes, and the purple marks that appeared on active children like punctuation. These were deliberate, patterned, colors stacked on colors, the deep black purple of injuries that were days old, layered over the green and yellow of injuries that were weeks old. The entire palette of progressive harm laid out on a child's body like evidence in a trial that had never happened. The crowd was completely silent. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, the silence of people who understood that whatever they said next would not be adequate to what they were looking at and had the dignity to recognize that inadequacy rather than attempt to fill the space anyway. Cal stood up slowly. He turned to face the ring of men and spoke in the voice that carried without being raised, the voice that meant what it said and required no repetition. Find out who she belongs to, now. The command moved through the assembly in outward phones, appearing men peeling off from the ring and moving with purpose into the crowd. The network of 280 men activated with a speed and coordination that impressed even those who had watched it happen before. Conversations starting, contacts being pulled up, the collective intelligence of a large group of connected people being turned toward a single question. Garrett stayed where he was. The girl's eyes opened, gray-blue as he had seen from above, but larger than he had registered, too large. For the thin face, the irises very clear and very focused, tracking to him with the directness of someone who had learned to assess quickly and accurately. She looked at him the way people looked at things when they were deciding whether they could be trusted. Whatever she decided it in the space of a few seconds. Her hand moved, slowly without strength, a movement that was more intention than muscle, her small fingers finding the edge of his leather vest and curling around it. Not gripping, not clutching, but holding. The way a drowning person holds onto the thing they have reached, not with confidence, but with the last available version of hope. Hey, Garrett said again. What's your name? Vera leaned in gently. Sweetie, can you tell us your name? The girl's lips moved. The sound was very quiet, almost lost under the ambient noise of the rally that was still happening all around them, the world continuing its ordinary business, while this extraordinary thing occurred at its edge. Ellie, Vera looked at Garrett, then back at Ellie. Ellie, where is your mom or dad? Can you tell me where they are? The response was immediate. The girl's entire body tensed, a full-body flinch that traveled from her shoulders down through her spine, a motor reflex so deeply conditioned that the word itself, the word that should have meant safety, had been converted into a trigger for the opposite. Her fingers tightened on Garrett's vest. Not the tentative holding of a moment before, but something with more urgency in it. Don't. The word came out barely above a breath. Don't tell him where I am. The words moved through the assembled men like a current through water, invisible, but felt the atmosphere changing in the way atmospheres changed when everyone in a space understood something at the same moment. Boone's hand landed on Garrett's shoulder, not in comfort. In the weight of shared recognition, two men who had both understood what they had just heard and were standing on the same side of the understanding. The ambulance arrived 8 minutes later. The paramedics moved with the efficient calm of people accustomed to walking into situations that had already peaked, assessed Ellie quickly, and began the IV line with a practiced speed that Garrett noted and was grateful for. They worked under the observation of 200 men who had formed a perimeter around the scene without being asked, facing outward. When the paramedics moved toward the ambulance, Garrett stood up with Ellie. Her hand was still on his vest. He looked at the paramedics. He looked at the open doors of the ambulance. He stepped in. Nobody said he could. Nobody said he couldn't. He sat on the bench inside, and Ellie lay on the gurney beside him, and her hand stayed where it was curled around the edge of his vest, and the doors closed, and the ambulance moved through the crowd with its lights going. During the ride, Ellie's eyes opened twice. Both times they went directly to Garrett's face, confirmed he was still present, and closed again. The female paramedic watched this happen. She did not comment. Her expression said that she understood what she was looking at and that it was not her place to rearrange it. Sturgis Regional Hospital smelled the way small regional hospitals always smelled: antiseptic and industrial cleaner, and the faintly sweet undertone of hand sanitizer mounted at every doorframe. They moved Ellie quickly, the emergency team taking over with the coordinated speed that Garrett recognized from combat medicine. The same quality of purposeful urgency, each person knowing their function and executing it without the need for direction. Garrett ended up in the hallway. He stood with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, and his eyes on the door of the room they had taken her into. Boone arrived 12 minutes later. He had ridden over from the rally and stood beside Garrett without speaking, because Boone understood the value of silence in the ways that mattered. They stood there together for 40 minutes. Dr. Patricia Woodward came out of the room at the end of those 40 minutes. She was a pediatrician, mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been trained into composure by years of delivering news that people were not ready to receive. She looked at Garrett and she looked at Boone, and she made whatever assessment she made about who they were and why they were there, and she began speaking anyway. "She's malnourished," Dr. Woodward said. Her voice was low, calibrated for the hallway, for the ears of the two men in front of her and no others. "Significantly, we're looking at weeks, possibly months of inadequate nutrition. She has multiple contusions in various stages of healing across her back, shoulders, and upper arms." She paused. "2 cracked ribs, one partially healed, one recent. There are ligature marks on her wrists consistent with restraint." The fluorescent lights above them buzzed with a frequency that Garrett could feel in the back of his skull. "This child has been systematically abused," Dr. Woodward said. "This is not a one-time incident. This is sustained deliberate harm, and the pattern of injuries indicates escalation over time. Whoever is responsible for this child has been hurting her for a long time and hurting her with increasing severity." Garrett closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the hospital room in Knoxville where Caleb had not been, where there had been no long descent. No weeks of watching, only the phone call, and then the understanding that he was the parent of a child who was no longer alive, the most abrupt and absolute lesson in helplessness that the world had available to teach. He had stood in hallways like this one, receiving information from doctors like this one, and the information had reached him and had not been translatable into anything actionable because there was nothing to act on. The thing that had already happened. The damage was complete. The only direction was the aftermath, and the aftermath was a 3-year road that had led him to a bench outside a saloon in South Dakota. He opened his eyes. "Where is the person who did this?" he asked. The answer came from Boone's phone, not from the doctor. Boone had stepped a few feet down the hallway and was listening, and when he came back, his face was carrying controlled anger, the kind that had learned to move slowly because it knew that the speed of its movement determined whether it was useful or destructive. "His name is Warren Pruitt," Boone said quietly. 46 years old, lives out on County Road 18 east of town. He's her stepfather. Her mother died 2 years ago. I-90 winter storm, black ice. After that, Pruitt got custody by default. No biological father in the system. Delafontaine, a neighbor on the same road, called CPS twice in the last year. Both times closed. Both times Pruitt cleaned up, dressed the girl nice, said the right things. Garrett listened. He stood with the information and felt the weight of it distribute itself across everything he already knew. The weight on the road, the light in the sky, the way the hallway smelled, the faint sound of Ellie's monitors through the closed door. Both times, he said. Both times, Boone confirmed. Garrett pressed the heel of his hand against the wall beside him and held it there. The wall was cool and solid. He focused on that. The temperature of the wall, the resistance of it, the way it did not move regardless of how much pressure he applied. Cal knows, he said. Cal called an emergency meeting. Full chapter. Parking lot behind the iron saddle. 30 minutes. Garrett did not go to the meeting. He went back to Ellie's room instead. He pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside and stood for a moment while his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. She was awake. Her eyes found him immediately when he came through the door, the same direct assessment he had seen on the street, the same rapid cataloging of the situation, and then something settled in her face when she confirmed he was who she remembered. The IV ran from her left arm to a bag of nutrients hanging from a metal stand. A thin blanket covered her legs. Someone had left apple juice on the bedside table. Someone else had placed a small stuffed rabbit near her right hand, the kind of thing a hospital pediatric unit kept in supply for exactly this kind of situation. She looked very small in the bed, the kind of small that was not simply about physical size, but about the gap between what a 7-year-old was supposed to be and what this particular 7-year-old had been reduced to. A gap that made looking at her feel like looking at something that should not have been allowed to happen in a world where attention was paid. "You stayed," she said. "Yeah," Garrett said. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. He was aware distantly that he was still wearing his vest, the iron wolves patch visible on his back, the various pins and insignia of 15 years of membership arranged across the front. He was aware of how he looked, the tattoos and the gray-streaked beard, and the bearing of a man who had spent decades in environments that required a certain kind of hardness. He did not try to soften any of it. He had learned that children read authenticity before they read surface, that they made their assessments of trustworthiness from deeper signals than adults gave them credit for. Ellie looked at him for a moment with those gray-blue eyes that were too large for her thin face. "I walked toward the loud sound," she said. Her voice was small but clearer now, the fluids already doing their work. "The motorcycles. I heard them from the road." Garrett looked at her. "I heard them from the road," she said again, as if confirming the memory to herself. "He was sleeping. He always sleeps after. I went out the back and I walked toward the sound." A pause. "He always said I had to be quiet. I thought if something was that loud, it wasn't afraid of anything. I thought maybe if I could get close enough to it, I wouldn't have to be afraid either." The logic of a 7-year-old mind navigating a world that had given her only wrong options for a very long time, and in the space between those wrong options, finding a direction that was not given to her by anyone that she had arrived at herself through the clarity of a child who has run out of alternatives and must finally make a choice. Loud things were not afraid, therefore loud things might be safe. Therefore, she had walked toward the loudest thing she could find. 12 miles, barefoot, 103 degrees, 2 cracked ribs, a fever, a body that had been systematically starved for months. She had walked 12 miles. Garrett sat with that for a moment and did not speak. He pressed his palm flat against his thigh and held it there, the pressure grounding him, holding the line between the man sitting in this chair and every other version of himself that was trying to find a way to the surface. The version that had stood in a different hospital hallway and received different news and had been completely catastrophically unable to do anything about it. The version that had driven 900 miles trying to put distance between himself and that helplessness. He looked at Ellie. She was watching him with the patient directness of a child who had learned to read silences, who had developed the ability to wait in a quiet room without making noise that might attract the wrong kind of attention. "You were brave," he said. "I'm scared all the time," she said. "That's what brave means," Garrett said. "It means you're scared and you do it anyway." She considered this. He could see her considering it, the slight change in her expression as something was rearranged, some understanding that had been organized one way, shifting into a different configuration. Then she looked at the window where the late afternoon light was moving towards something amber and warm. Her eyes moved in the unhurried way of a child who had been awake for a long time and was finally in a place where she did not need to monitor the door. Within 2 minutes, her breathing changed. Her eyes closed. Her fingers, which had found the edge of his vest where he had draped it over the bed rail, stayed where they were. Garrett sat in the chair beside her and listened to the monitors and listened to her breathe. And outside the window, the August sun continued its descent toward the Black Hills. And somewhere across town, 280 men were assembling in a parking lot to decide what happened next. And Garrett was not among them because he was already exactly where he needed to be. He reached over and picked up the children's book that a nurse had left on the bedside table. It was about a bear who got lost in the woods. He opened it to the first page and began to read quietly, giving each character a slightly different voice, not because he was skilled at it, but because it was what you did. It was what he had always done. The room was still except for the soft turning of pages and the faint sound of the machines keeping count of her heartbeat, and somewhere down the hall, a phone ringing twice and going silent. Outside, the rally continued its ordinary business, indifferent and loud. Garrett turned another page. Cal Merritt's voice carried across the gravel parking lot behind the Iron Saddle Saloon, the way it always carried without effort, without the artificial amplification of a man who needed to perform authority because he had never actually possessed it. Cal's authority was structural. It had been built over 14 years of consistent decisions made under inconsistent circumstances. And the men who stood before him now in the fading August heat recognized it the way they recognized the sound of a well-tuned engine, not because they were told to listen, because the sound itself commanded attention. 280 men in a loose semicircle, the sun dropping toward the western ridge, painting the chrome of their bikes in shades of copper and fire. The temperature had fallen to 89 degrees, but nobody noticed. The air between the men was charged with something that had nothing to do with weather. Cal stood on the bed of a flatbed truck that one of the members had backed into the lot. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Most of you saw what happened this afternoon," he said. "A little girl collapsed in the street. Her name is Ellie. She is 7 years old. She walked 12 miles on bare feet through 103-degree heat to get away from the man who has been hurting her. The medical report says cracked ribs, ligature marks, months of systematic abuse and starvation." The lot was completely silent. The distant noise of the rally reached them from beyond the buildings like something from another world, a world that was continuing its ordinary operations while this one stood still. Her stepfather's name is Warren Pruitt. He lives out on County Road 18. CPS was called twice in the last year. Twice the case was closed. Twice this child was left with the man who was hurting her. Cal paused. He looked across the faces of his brothers. The system looked at her and decided she wasn't worth protecting. "We are going to make a different decision." Boone Draper stepped forward from the second row. "What's the play, Cal?" Cal looked at him, then at the assembled chapter. "We do this right. We do not break laws. We do not give law enforcement a reason to come after us. We do not touch Warren Pruitt. But we make sure that child is safe, and we make sure the man who did this to her understands that the world he was living in no longer exists." The plan divided itself into 3 columns, with the efficiency of men who had operated as a coordinated body for long enough that the logistics of collective action had become second nature. Boone would take 30 riders to the hospital and establish a rotating guard 4 men at a time in 6-hour shifts around the clock. A retired attorney in the chapter named Douglas Hale would coordinate with the Meade County Sheriff's Department, providing witness statements and whatever legal pressure the chapter's network could bring to bear on the formal process. The remaining 200 would do something that required no law to be broken and no line to be crossed. They would ride to County Road 18. They would park. They would be seen. The convoy formed at dusk, 200 Harley-Davidsons in a column that stretched the length of 3 city blocks before it finished assembling engines, turning over one by one, a rolling thunder that built from individual to collective, from sound to weather, from weather to something that the earth itself seemed to register. The column moved south out of Sturgis onto the county road with its headlights on and its formation tight, a river of steel and light moving through the darkening South Dakota landscape with a quality of purpose that could not be mistaken for anything else. The sound reached Warren Pruitt's property long before the first headlight appeared over the hill. At Sturgis Regional Hospital Room 214 was quiet. Garrett had finished the Bear book an hour earlier, reading it through twice, because Ellie had been nearly asleep at the end of the first reading, and he had not been certain she had heard the ending. He wanted her to hear the ending. The Bear found his way home by following the stars, which was the kind of ending that a 7-year-old girl who had been navigating by sound in the dark deserved to hear at least once before she went to sleep. She was sleeping now. Deeply, the monitors reporting a pulse that was still faster than it should be, but steadier than it had been in the ambulance. The IV was doing its work. The fever had come down half a degree. Dr. Woodward had said that was encouraging, using the word with the careful precision of a physician who had learned not to use stronger words than the evidence supported. Garrett sat in the chair with his vest draped over the rail of the bed, Ellie's fingers still loosely touching the leather even in sleep. He sat the way he had learned to sit in waiting rooms and field positions, and all the other places where sitting still was the only available action, with his body at rest and his mind doing whatever it needed to do, which tonight meant returning repeatedly to the same set of images without his permission. Caleb in the garage on the overturned bucket, his small hands wrapped around a wrench that was too large for them, listening to Garrett explain the relationship between the carburetor and the fuel line with the focused silence of a child who was genuinely interested rather than performing interest. Caleb, at 8 years old, had developed the habit of asking a follow-up question after every explanation, not to fill silence, but because the explanation had generated a genuine new question, and the chain of questions and answers could go on for an hour before Caleb was satisfied. Garrett had never told him to stop, had never looked at his watch and indicated that the questions were becoming an imposition. He had answered every single one carefully, completely, the way you answered questions from someone whose curiosity you intended to protect. He had not known that he was building a memory. He had simply been present in the evening with his son, answering questions about engines, and the memory had built itself around him without his awareness. And now it was one of the primary structures of his interior life, load-bearing in ways he had not understood until the weight it carried had nothing left to rest on. A nurse named Janet came in at 9 o'clock to check Ellie's vitals and change the IV bag. She was 60, efficient and warm in the way of someone who had been doing this long enough to be both without effort. She looked at Garrett without surprise. The hospital staff had already adjusted to the presence of the large, tattooed, leather-vested man who had arrived with the child and not left. "There are 6 men in the waiting room," Janet said quietly while she worked. "They arrived about an hour ago. They've been very polite." "They'll rotate out at midnight," Garrett said. "Different 6 will come in." Janet nodded as if this were standard information. "Can I get you anything coffee?" "Water's fine, thank you." She left. Garrett looked at Ellie's sleeping face. He thought about what Dr. Woodward had told him in the hallway. The words that he had heard and processed and then heard again, the way words sometimes needed to complete 2 circuits before they fully registered. Systematic. That was the word the doctor had used. Systematic abuse. Not accidental, not situational. Systematic, which meant deliberate, which meant recurring, which meant that every single day for months this child had woken up in a house where the person responsible for her safety was the primary source of her danger. And she had walked 12 miles to get away from it, on bare feet, with 2 cracked ribs. Boone appeared in the doorway at 10:15. He moved quietly the way large men sometimes learn to move, when they understood that their size made quietness a courtesy rather than a default. He looked at Ellie sleeping, then at Garrett, and kept his voice to a murmur. "Convoy reached Pruitt's property about an hour ago," he said. 200 bikes. They parked along the road, shut everything down. Lights off, engines off. Cal stood out front. Garrett waited. Pruitt came out on the porch, looked at them for about 2 minutes, went back inside. That's all. That's all. 20 minutes later, the Meade County Sheriff arrived with 3 patrol cars and a warrant. Douglas had been on the phone with the DA's office for 4 hours. The medical report from Dr. Woodward, the statements from Vera Hutchins, the records from 2 CPS calls, and signed statements from Delafontaine and 2 other county road neighbors. Boone paused. Pruitt was trying to leave through the back when they got there. Had a bag packed. One of the deputies was already at the truck. Garrett said nothing for a moment. He looked at the window where the night was fully dark now, and the glass reflected the room back at him, the 2 of them, the sleeping girl and the man in the chair. He's in custody, Garrett said. Meade County Detention Center. Bail hearing Monday. Douglas says the DA is going for no bail given the medical evidence and the flight risk. Boone glanced at Ellie. His voice, already quiet, went quieter. She walked 12 miles, Garrett. I know. In this heat. I know. Boone put his hand briefly on Garrett's shoulder. Then he left as quietly as he had come, going back to the waiting room, to relieve whatever combination of men was currently sitting there maintaining the perimeter that Cal had established, and that would remain established until the situation resolved itself into something that did not require a perimeter. The night passed in the compressed way of hospital nights, time measured not in hours, but in the intervals between nursing checks and the rhythm of the monitors and the quality of the light coming through the window. Blue-black and then gray, and then the first pale suggestion of morning along the eastern edge of the sky. Garrett slept briefly in the chair, the trained sleep of a man who had learned to take rest in small units and in uncomfortable positions, waking at each nursing check and returning to sleep when the nurse left. Ellie woke at 6:30 in the morning. She woke the way children woke who had slept deeply for the first time in a long time, gradually surfacing through layers, her eyes opening and closing twice before they stayed open. She lay still for a moment, processing the room, the ceiling, the monitors, the IV in her arm, and then she turned her head and found Garrett in the chair and her face settled. "You're still here," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the ceiling again. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, laying a pale rectangle across the foot of her bed. She watched it for a while. "Is he in jail?" she asked. "Yes," Garrett said. The same way he had said, "No, he's not coming near you." Not a reassurance, a fact. She absorbed this. Her expression did not change dramatically. She did not cry or smile or show any of the large demonstrative responses that the question might have expected. She simply processed it with a quiet internal thoroughness that reminded Garrett of someone much older, of a person who had learned that reactions cost something and had become careful about the expenditure. "Okay," she said. They were quiet together. The morning light moved slowly across the bed. "What's his name?" Ellie asked. "Yours." "Garrett." She tried it out silently, her lips moving around it. "Then you read good voices." "My son taught me," Garrett said. He had not planned to say it. The sentence arrived complete before he had decided to speak it, assembled somewhere below the deliberate level of his mind and delivered without permission. He felt the familiar compression response activate the automatic mechanism that took anything approaching that territory and pressed it down, reduced it, converted it from flood to stone. But the sentence was already in the air. Ellie turned her head to look at him. "You have a son." "I had one," Garrett said. "His name was Caleb." She looked at him with those eyes that were too large for her thin face, and she did not fill the silence with the various things that adults filled it, with the expressions of sympathy and the questions about what happened and the attempts to locate the loss within a framework of meaning that made it easier to hold. She was 7 years old, and she understood silence, and she let it be what it was. After a moment, she said, "He liked engines." Garrett looked at her. He had not mentioned engines. "Yeah," he said. "He did. How did you know?" She glanced at the vest, at the patch and the pins and the iconography of 15 years on the road. "You seem like someone whose son would like engines," she said. Garrett looked at the window. The morning light was fully established now, the pale rectangle on the bed brightening towards something that could be called warm. "He did," he said again. And then because the sentence was there, and the morning was what it was, and the girl in the bed had walked 12 miles to find something loud enough to trust, he asked a lot of questions. "Did you answer them?" "Every one." She nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then she reached out and touched the edge of his vest, where it lay over the bed rail, the same gesture she had made on the street when her body was failing, and her will was not. Just the fingertips. Just contact. They had breakfast together, the cafeteria food that a volunteer brought up on a tray, scrambled eggs and toast and apple juice. And Garrett watched Ellie eat with the careful attention of a man watching someone remember how to do something their body had almost forgotten. She ate slowly, deliberately, taking each bite with a thoughtfulness that was not pickiness, but the opposite. The thoughtfulness of someone who had learned not to waste anything because waste was a luxury that had not been available to them. She ate everything on the plate and then looked at it for a moment as if surprised that it was gone. Garrett went down to the cafeteria and brought back another plate. She ate that too. Dr. Woodward came by at 9 o'clock and examined Ellie with the same focused efficiency of the previous evening. The fever was down to 101. The IV had made significant progress on the dehydration. The cracked ribs would heal with time and rest, and the kind of nutrition that was now finally being provided. Dr. Woodward said all of this in the calm, measured language of a physician reporting facts. But her eyes, when she looked at Garrett, carried something additional. A recognition of the situation that the clinical language was not designed to contain. She left. Garrett pulled his chair back to the bedside. In the 2 days that followed, a rhythm established itself in room 214. Garrett read. Ellie listened. He brought food from the cafeteria and watched her eat with the focused appreciation of someone rediscovering something essential. The chapter rotated through the waiting room in shifts of 6, polite and steady nodding to the nurses stepping aside for the doctors occupying space without claiming it. The hospital staff had moved from initial wariness to something approaching acceptance, nurses stopping to update Garrett on Ellie's progress, as if this arrangement, this tattooed man in the chair, and the small girl whose fingers found his vest in sleep were entirely unremarkable. On the 3rd day, Ellie asked for crayons. A volunteer found a box in the pediatric supply closet and brought it with a stack of blank paper. Ellie spent an hour drawing motorcycles, her tongue visible at the corner of her mouth, in the expression of concentrated effort that children had when they were drawing something that mattered to them. The motorcycles were enormous and vibrantly colored with wheels roughly the size of the body of each bike, and tiny riders on top wearing black vests with very determined expressions. She held one up for Garrett's assessment. "That's a good bike," he said. "The wheels are a little big," she said critically. "Little bit." She looked back down at the paper, added a detail to the wheel that she seemed satisfied with, then set the drawing on his side of the tray table without comment. He understood this was a gift. He folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his vest. It was on the 5th day that everything nearly came apart. Boone called Garrett's phone at 7:42 in the morning with a voice that was carrying something carefully, the way you carried something fragile, keeping your movement smooth and your grip steady. "Pruitt's lawyer filed an emergency motion this morning," Boone said. "Temporary guardian rights. They're arguing that until a court formally terminates his guardianship, Warren Pruitt retains legal authority over Ellie's care and placement. They want her released from the hospital into his custody." Garrett stood up from the chair. He walked to the window without being aware of the decision to walk. Outside, the South Dakota morning was bright and empty and entirely indifferent. "He's in jail," Garrett said. "He bonded out yesterday afternoon. The DA went for no bail and didn't get it. Judge set it at $50,000. Someone posted it." Boone's voice remained level. "The motion is in front of Judge Harlan at the Meade County Courthouse. Hearing is at 11 this morning." Garrett looked at the window, at the bright indifferent morning, at the parking lot below where the current rotation of 6 iron wolves sat on their bikes in a loose formation that was not quite a blockade, but communicated something similar. "Claire Addison," he said, Claire was the social worker from the state's Department of Social Services who had come to the hospital on the second day, a serious and methodical woman in her 40s who had asked questions and taken notes and said she would be in contact. Already called. She's been on with Douglas since 6 this morning. She's filing a counter motion requesting emergency protective custody designation under state statute. She needs to get the medical documentation submitted to the judge in the next 2 hours. Garrett moved back to the bedside. Ellie was still sleeping the early hour and the accumulated exhaustion keeping her under. He looked at her face. The bruise along her jaw had faded slightly from purple to the greenish yellow of healing. Her breathing was even. "What are her chances?" Garrett asked. Boone was quiet for a beat. "Douglas says 60-40 in our favor if Claire gets the documentation in time. The medical evidence is overwhelming, but the statute on emergency guardianship removal has a high bar, and if the judge is conservative about guardian rights, he's not her parent. He has legal standing as her guardian, which functionally gives him the same protections until a court says otherwise." Another pause. "Douglas and Claire are doing everything that can be done, Garrett. The hearing is at 11. Garrett hung up. He sat down in the chair. He looked at Ellie sleeping and thought about the phrase legal standing and what it meant that a man who had done what this man had done could walk out of a jail on $50,000 and show up in a courtroom and invoke his rights as if the cracked ribs and the ligature marks and the 12 miles of bare feet on burning asphalt were facts that existed in a separate universe from the one where his legal standing was honored. He thought about Caleb. He thought about the helplessness of standing in a hospital hallway receiving information that you could not act on the floor, dropping out from under you, and the fall having no bottom. He thought about Ellie saying, "I walked toward the loud sound." He thought about the reasoning that had produced that decision. Loud things are not afraid. Therefore, loud things might be safe. He was going to be worthy of that reasoning. He picked up his phone and called Douglas Hale. Douglas answered on the first ring. He was 63 sharp and had spent 30 years as a trial attorney before retiring and joining the chapter, because as he had once told Garrett, he had spent 30 years fighting for people in courtrooms and wanted to spend the rest of his life riding with people who fought for each other everywhere else. He had the voice of a man who was completely at home with complexity and completely unmoved by pressure. "Tell me what you need from me," Garrett said. "Your written account of everything you observed from the moment you saw Ellie until the paramedics took over. Time sequence specifics, the physical condition you observed, what she said, exactly what she said in your words. I need it in the next 45 minutes. You'll have it in 30. He wrote it by hand on the notepad the hospital had left on the bedside table, printing clearly and completely the account of a former Marine who had been trained to report accurately and specifically, who understood that the value of an observation depended entirely on the precision with which it was rendered. He described the heat in the crowd and the movement he had seen that did not fit. He described the dress and the matted hair and the bare feet on asphalt that had been cooking for 7 hours. He described what Vera Hutchins had found when she lifted the sleeve. He wrote down Ellie's exact words. "Don't tell him where I am." I walked toward the loud sound. He wrote it all down. He photographed each page with his phone and sent it to Douglas. He looked at his watch. 27 minutes. At 11 o'clock, he was sitting in the hospital hallway because he could not sit in the room without waking Ellie, and he did not want to wake Ellie until he knew what was on the other side of the hearing. He sat with his phone in his hand and waited. Outside the hospital, Boone had quietly doubled the rotation. 12 men now instead of 6 arranged in 2 rows along the hospital entrance, their presence neither aggressive nor concealed, simply factual. They were there. They would continue to be there. This was a fact about the world that was not going to change. Douglas called at 12:43. Garrett picked up before the first ring finished. "Claire got it in," Douglas said. "All of it. The complete medical documentation, Vera's professional assessment, your written account, the CPS records showing 2 prior reports and affidavits from Delafontaine and 2 other county road residents. Judge Harlan reviewed everything and issued an emergency protective custody order. Ellie stays under state protective supervision until the guardianship case is fully adjudicated. Pruitt's motion was denied. Garrett let out a breath. "How close was it?" he asked. A pause. The hearing ran 2 hours. At one point, the judge asked Pruitt's attorney to clarify the statute on emergency guardian rights in cases of contested medical findings. Another pause longer. 4 hours, Garrett. If Claire had needed another 4 hours to compile the documentation, the outcome might have been different. Garrett sat with that. He sat with the specific number. 4 hours, the width of the gap between one version of the next year of Ellie's life and another version. 4 hours. "Is it over?" he asked. "The emergency phase is over. The guardianship case will take months. Claire will file for formal termination of Pruitt's rights. That's a separate proceeding." Douglas's voice carried the even quality of a man delivering facts without embellishment. "But she is safe right now. Right now she is safe." Garrett thanked him and hung up. He sat in the hallway for another minute. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him. A gurney moved past at the far end of the corridor. A nurse walked by with a tray. Ordinary hospital time resuming its ordinary pace after 4 hours of something else. He got up and went back into the room. Ellie was awake, bent over a fresh sheet of paper with a red crayon, her tongue at the corner of her mouth. She looked up when Garrett came in. "Is everything okay?" she asked without looking at him directly, her eyes still on the paper. He had come to understand this particular indirection, the way she checked the temperature of a room through peripheral observation rather than direct inquiry. A skill built over time, a necessary one. "Everything is okay," he said. She nodded once, went back to the drawing. "Good," she said, and then still without looking up. "Can you read more of the book?" He pulled the chair to the bedside. He reached for the Bear book. "We finished it," he said. "You were almost asleep." "I know." She kept her eyes on the drawing. "I want to hear it again." He opened it to the first page. He gave the bear his voice. He gave the other animals their voices. He read slowly with the understanding that the point was not to get through the book, but to be in it, to stay inside the world of it for as long as the reading lasted. Because inside the world of the book, the bear was lost, but not afraid, and the forest was dark, but not permanent, and the brightest star was always there if you knew to look up. Outside the room, in the waiting room at the end of the hall, 6 men in leather vests sat in the chairs arranged along the wall, their hands on their knees, their eyes on the door. They had not been asked to come. They would not be asked to leave. They would be there when the shift changed, and different men would take their seats, and the perimeter would hold, because it had been decided, and when the Iron Wolves decided something, the decision remained until the situation was resolved. In the parking lot of the Meade County Detention Center, Warren Pruitt sat in a vehicle with his attorney and learned that his emergency motion had been denied. He learned that the chapter of men who had parked 200 motorcycles in front of his house had not dispersed. He learned that the neighbor woman he had dismissed as an irrelevant inconvenience had provided a sworn affidavit to the court. He learned that the nurse from the rally had submitted a professional medical assessment that the judge had described as among the most thorough documentation of systematic child abuse he had encountered in his courtroom. He learned that the world he had been living in, the one where a quiet house on a county road outside of Sturgis was sufficiently invisible to sustain what he had been doing, no longer existed. At the hospital, the bear found the brightest star. He walked toward it through the dark forest steadily without stopping. The trees thinned. The light grew. He came out of the woods onto a hillside he recognized, and below him was the valley where he had started, and the path down was clear. Garrett read the last line. Ellie's breathing had slowed. He closed the book. Her fingers, as they always were, as they had been since the moment on the street when she had made her decision, and his vest had been the thing available to hold, were touching the leather where it lay over the rail. He sat in the chair. Outside, the South Dakota sky was moving toward evening, the light changing from the flat bright of afternoon to something more complex, something with depth and color in it, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had looked at it for thousands of years and decided it meant something. Garrett sat in the chair and let the evening come. The trial of Warren Pruitt was set for October, which meant that September belonged to the slower, quieter machinery of consequence. the kind that did not announce itself with sirens or the rolling thunder of 200 motorcycles on a county road, but moved instead through courtrooms and filing offices and the accumulated weight of documented evidence grinding forward with the patience of a process that had learned to outlast the people who tried to interrupt it. Garrett left Sturgis on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September. He had stayed 3 weeks longer than he had planned. Cal had not commented on this. Boone had not commented on this. The chapter had rotated its hospital presence for the full duration without complaint or question. They understood what was happening without being told the way the chapter understood most things. Not a skill exactly, more a shared frequency tuned over years of riding together. Ellie was discharged from Sturgis Regional Hospital on a Friday in the first week of September. Her weight had climbed. The fever was gone. The bruises were fading through their spectrum purple to green to the pale yellow of the body reclaiming itself from damage. Dr. Woodward signed the discharge papers with the careful notation of a physician who was releasing a patient into circumstances she had assessed thoroughly and found provisionally adequate. The circumstances were Delafontaine's ranch on County Road 18, 3 miles past the property, where Warren Pruitt's house sat empty and locked, a detail that Claire Addison had flagged as potentially distressing for Ellie, and that Ellie herself had addressed with the directness that Garrett had come to understand was simply how she operated. "I don't care about the house," she had told Claire during one of their sessions, in the matter-of-fact tone of a 7-year-old stating a preference about lunch. "I care about where I'm going, not what I'm passing." Delafontaine had completed emergency foster certification in the 2 weeks following Ellie's hospitalization, supported by Claire's coordination and the endorsement of Dr. Woodward, and in a letter that Douglas Hale had helped compose the character assessment of Cal Merritt on behalf of the Iron Wolves chapter. Della was 58, a former school teacher who had retired to the property she had inherited from her parents, a working ranch with 4 horses, 2 dogs, 12 chickens, and the ordered calm that came from decades of attention to living things. She had called CPS twice for Ellie, without knowing Ellie, which Garrett considered among the most important facts about her character. She had seen something wrong and reported it twice, even after the first report resulted in nothing. That was not a small thing. Ellie had been introduced to the horses within 48 hours of arriving at Della's ranch. The Palomino, whose name was Butterscotch, and who had the serene temperament of an animal that had been well handled for many years, had lowered her enormous head and allowed Ellie to press her face into the warm curve of her neck. And Ellie had stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed and her small hands gripping the mane. And Della had watched from the fence rail and said nothing, because some moments required silence to be what they were. Garrett had driven to the ranch the morning of his departure. He had not told Ellie he was leaving the previous evening because he had learned in 3 weeks that Ellie processed information better when she had time to see the thing coming rather than receiving it as an accomplished fact. He had told her 2 days before. He had told her clearly and without softening it with reassurances that would have undermined her trust in his accuracy. "I'm going back to Knoxville," he had said. "I have a shop. It's been 3 weeks without me there. I need to go back." She had absorbed this with the internal processing silence that he had learned to read as thinking rather than withdrawal. Then, "Will you call every night 7:30? She had nodded. The nod was a transaction, a confirmation that the terms were acceptable, that the arrangement was being entered into by both parties with clear understanding. He recognized it because it was the same nod he gave when Cal proposed something at chapter that he had assessed and found reasonable. At the ranch on the morning of his departure, Ellie was in the paddock with Butterscotch. She saw him coming across the yard, and she walked to the fence rail and climbed it, so she was at eye level with him, which was something she had taken to doing in the last week, adjusting the geometry of conversations so they happened face to face rather than with him looking down and her looking up. "You'll call tonight," she said. Not a question. 7:30, he said. She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes that had found him in the ambulance and confirmed he was there, and closed again with something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it. She had grown. Not in the dramatic, visible way of children in stories, but in the quieter way of a body that was receiving adequate nutrition for the first time in a long time, filling in at the edges, the hollows of her cheeks less pronounced, the collarbone less sharp beneath the skin. She reached out and put her hand flat on the lapel of his vest. Just the palm for a moment. Then she climbed back down from the fence rail and went back to Butterscotch. He drove south out of Sturgis in Boone's truck, which Boone had lent him because they had both agreed without extensive discussion that a motorcycle was the wrong vehicle for the return. He did not entirely understand why he had agreed to this until he was an hour south of the South Dakota border and realized that he had made the decision sometime in the past 3 weeks without being aware of making it. That the return trip was different from the departure. That arriving back in Knoxville was not the same as leaving Sturgis. That the distance this time meant something. The shop was as he had left it, managed in his absence by his 2 employees, a 30-year-old named Pete Dalton who could rebuild a carburetor in his sleep, and a 55-year-old named Roy Sutherland who had been working with Garrett since he opened the place 7 years ago, and who ran the front end with the unflappable efficiency of a man who understood that the business of a repair shop was mostly the business of making people feel their problem was being taken seriously. They had handled the 3 weeks without complaint. The books were current. 3 bikes had been completed and picked up. 2 new jobs had come in. Garrett thanked them and paid them, and then sat in his office for 20 minutes looking at the shop floor without seeing it until Pete knocked on the door frame and asked if everything was all right, and Garrett said yes and meant most of it. He called Ellie at 7:30 that evening. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been waiting near the phone. He told her about the drive. She told him about the chickens, specifically about a hen that Della called persistent because it had figured out how to open the latch on the coop gate and let itself and several others out into the yard on 3 separate occasions. She told him this with the gravity of someone reporting a significant engineering development. He called her the next evening, and the evening after that. The calls became the structure around which the rest of the day organized itself, the fixed point from which he oriented the hours before and after. He was aware of what this meant. He was aware that he was doing something that had a trajectory, that the calls were not simply calls, but the beginning of a path whose direction he had already decided on, even if he had not yet spoken that decision out loud to anyone who needed to hear it. He spoke it out loud to Claire Addison on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of September. He had driven to the Department of Social Services field office in Rapid City without announcing himself because he wanted to have the conversation in person rather than on the phone, and he wanted to see the face of the person he was talking to when he said what he had to say. Claire Addison was the kind of woman who had developed the ability to receive information without showing the evaluation of it in real time. She listened to Garrett across the desk in her small office with a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand that she did not use while he was speaking. She let him finish completely before she said anything. This was a professional skill that very few people actually had. "What would I need to do to foster Ellie myself?" he asked. Claire looked at him. She looked in the way of a person who processed information through multiple simultaneous lenses at the leather vest, the tattoos, the bearing of a man who occupied space with the comfortable certainty of someone who had never needed to shrink himself. She looked at the face of a 44-year-old man who had driven from Knoxville to Rapid City without an appointment to ask a question he could have asked on the phone. "It's not simple," she said. "I didn't expect it to be. Background check, comprehensive home study, psychological evaluation, training requirements, references. The process takes 3 to 4 months minimum, and that's assuming everything clears on schedule." She paused. "And there will be questions about your club affiliation, Mr. Brixton. Questions that will need to be answered directly and thoroughly." "I have a Marine discharge record," Garrett said. "No criminal history. I own my house. I have a stable income. I have a support network of men who have been standing guard over that child around the clock for 3 weeks without being asked twice." He leaned forward slightly. "I had a son. His name was Caleb. He was 8 years old when he died. I know what it costs to protect a child. I know what it costs not to." Claire looked at him for a long moment. The legal pad remained unmarked. "I'll send you the initial application packet," she said. The process begins when you submit it. He submitted it the following Monday from Knoxville. The home study came in October. A social worker named Beverly Marsh, who drove a sensible sedan and wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and moved through Garrett's house with the systematic attention of someone who had done this enough times to know what she was looking for and where it usually hid. She looked at the structure, the cleanliness, the functionality. She looked at the spare bedroom that Garrett had painted yellow the previous weekend. Two coats, the windows open and a box fan running to clear the fumes, the color chosen from a paint chip that he had spent longer selecting than he would have predicted. Beverly Marsh stood in the doorway of the yellow room and looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote something on her clipboard. The bookshelf he had installed along the east wall was full. He had gone to the bookstore in Knoxville and told a young woman there that he needed children's books for a 7-year-old girl who had not had access to books and who was very intelligent and very serious and would not be patronized by anything that underestimated her. The young woman had spent 45 minutes with him in the children's section and had put together a collection that covered 3 shelves. He had bought all of it. The comforter on the bed had stars on it, not the cartoon kind with faces, but a realistic print of an actual night sky, the kind of sky you could see from South Dakota in August when the light pollution was minimal and the Milky Way was visible as a band of actual light across the actual darkness. He had found it online after Ellie had mentioned during one of their 7:30 calls that during the worst times at the house on County Road 18, she would look through the window at the stars and pretend she was somewhere else. Beverly Marsh saw the star comforter and wrote something else on her clipboard. Warren Pruitt's trial began in the second week of October. It lasted 4 days. The evidence was comprehensive, and the testimony was consistent, and the jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced Pruitt to 22 years, noting in his remarks that the systematic and deliberate nature of the abuse, the extended duration, the use of psychological coercion in addition to physical harm, and the targeting of a vulnerable child in his care warranted the upper range of the sentencing guidelines. Garrett heard about the verdict from Douglas Hale, who called with the news in a voice that was professionally even and personally satisfied in equal measure. He called Ellie at 7:30 that evening and told her. She was quiet for a moment. 22 years, she said. Yes. Another pause. How old will I be in 22 years? 29, Garrett said. She was quiet again, doing the arithmetic that a 7-year-old did, translating the number into a distance, a landscape of time extending ahead of her. I'll be a grown-up, she said. You will. Okay, she said, and then the way she moved on from large things to smaller things, with a naturalness that was not avoidance, but a genuine economy of processing. Butterscotch figured out how to open the stall gate today. Della says she might have been teaching the other horses. He called her every night. November arrived with the quality of Tennessee autumns, the air cooling from the edges of the days inward, the leaves off the ridge behind his property going copper and gold in the morning light. He ran the shop. He worked on bikes in the evenings with the methodical attention that the work required and that his hands provided automatically while the rest of him was on a phone call at 7:30. He told Ellie about the bikes he was working on. She had opinions. She had developed opinions about motorcycles from her conversations with Garrett and from a library book that Della had gotten for her about the history of American motorcycles, which Ellie had read twice and was now reading a third time with annotations in the margins that Della had described to Garrett with the tone of someone who was genuinely impressed. She underlines things Della had told him during one of their separate calls. And then she writes questions in the margins, questions I can't answer. A pause. She's very bright, Garrett. I know, he said. She asks about you, Della said. During the day, not constantly, just checks. The way you check on something you're counting on. He sat with that for a while after the call ended. He sat in the chair in his living room in the house in Knoxville where the yellow room waited at the end of the hall, its bookshelves full, its star comforter smooth flat, and he sat with what Della had said and felt the weight of it, not as burden but as something else, something he had not felt the specific weight of in 3 years, something that needed to be there for someone. He worked through November with that understanding settled into him. He scheduled the home inspection follow-up that Beverly Marsh had requested for additional documentation. He completed the parenting preparation course that Claire Addison had required 8 sessions in a community room at a Knoxville church, sitting at folding tables with other prospective foster parents, learning protocols and frameworks that he absorbed with the same methodical attention he brought to engine repair. Understanding that this too was a system, that systems had logic, and that learning the logic was the first step toward operating within it effectively. He called Ellie every night at 7:30. The calls stretched longer as the weeks passed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally. The way trust stretched, the way two people learned the rhythm of each other's speech and began to fill it with more rather than less. She told him about school, about the teacher who let her check out 2 library books at a time instead of one after she returned the first pair within 3 days. She told him about a boy in her class named Marcus, who had decided she was his best friend without consulting her on the matter, which she found both presumptuous and after consideration acceptable. She told him about butterscotch and the other horses and the chickens and the particular South Dakota quality of the November cold, which was, she reported, a completely different category of cold than anything reasonable. He told her about the shop, about Pete's ongoing project of teaching himself to play guitar, which was not going well for anyone in the vicinity, about the 1967 Electroglide he had been restoring for a retired school teacher who wanted it running again before spring, about the ridge behind his house and the way the leaves came down all at once, some years and slowly other years, and this year they had come down all at once. And one morning he had looked out the kitchen window at the yard, and there were leaves everywhere, and none of them on the trees. "What color?" she asked. "What color? What? The leaves. What color were they?" "Yellow mostly," he said. "Some red. A lot of yellow." A pause. "Like the room," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Like the room." They were both quiet for a moment on opposite ends of a phone line that stretched 900 miles through the American interior, and the quiet was the kind that did not need to be filled. The formal hearing for the foster care application was scheduled for the second week of December in a family courtroom in Rapid City. Garrett drove up the night before and stayed at a motel and arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 for a 10 o'clock hearing, because arriving early was a habit so deeply installed that he could not have been late to something important if he had tried. The courtroom was small and clean, with the atmosphere of a room where serious decisions about ordinary lives were made on a regular basis. Family court had its own gravity, different from criminal court, less theatrical, but in some ways more final. The decisions made here touching the architecture of daily existence, rather than the dramatic punctuation of criminal consequence. Judge Eleanor Voss was 61 years old with gray hair pulled back and reading glasses that she wore on her face rather than on a chain, and an expression of considered attention that she appeared to maintain as a resting state. She had presided over family court in Meade County for 16 years. She had seen every version of the situation that family court produced, and she had developed the judgment that came from having seen enough to know that the obvious reading of a situation was frequently incomplete. Douglas Hale sat beside Garrett at the applicant's table. Claire Addison sat at a separate table as the DSS representative. The room was otherwise empty, family court hearings being closed proceedings, which meant that the 280 men who had driven from Knoxville and Billings and every point between to be here today were outside, in the parking lot. Garrett had told Cal that the hearing was closed. Cal had said yes. And then Cal had called the chapter, and 280 men had arrived in Rapid City the previous evening and parked their bikes and slept in motels and arrived at the courthouse parking lot at 9 in the morning and arranged themselves and their machines in a formation that was orderly and deliberate and entirely scrupulously within their legal rights as citizens. Engines off, in rows, facing the courthouse. Not a demonstration, not a protest, simply a fact about who was present and why. Judge Voss opened the hearing by reviewing the application documentation. She reviewed it thoroughly, which took 20 minutes, during which the room was quiet enough that Garrett could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. She asked Douglas several procedural questions. She reviewed the home study report from Beverly Marsh, which Garrett had not read in advance, and which Douglas had summarized for him as thorough and favorable without telling him what that meant specifically. Then she looked at Garrett directly. "Mr. Brixton," she said, "you are an active member of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, which has been the subject of law enforcement scrutiny at various points in its history. I need you to speak to that directly." Garrett had known this question was coming. He had thought about how to answer it for 6 weeks, not in the sense of constructing an answer that would be persuasive, but in the sense of locating the true answer, the one that was accurate rather than strategic. "The Iron Wolves are my brothers," he said. "I'm not going to tell you they're perfect or that the chapter's history is without complications. I don't think you'd believe me if I said that, and I don't think I'd respect myself for saying it." He paused. "What I can tell you is what I have observed in 15 years of membership. I can tell you that when a 7-year-old girl collapsed on a street in Sturgis, 280 men stopped what they were doing and did not stop until she was safe. I can tell you that those men have been maintaining a presence at a hospital and then at a foster home and now at this courthouse without being compensated, without being required, and without calling attention to themselves. I can tell you that the man sitting beside me is one of those men and that he has been providing legal coordination for this case since the first evening at no charge." He reached into the inner pocket of his vest and placed on the table in front of him, not sliding it toward the judge, but simply making it visible, the photograph of Caleb. 8 years old in the garage, holding the wrench that was too large for his hands, looking at the camera with the focused expression of a boy who was in the middle of learning something. "I had a son," Garrett said. "His name was Caleb. He died 3 years ago. I was not able to protect him from the thing that killed him, which was an accident and not something I could have stood between him and. What I can tell you is that there is a 7-year-old girl in a foster placement on County Road 18 outside Sturgis who walked 12 miles on bare feet in 103-degree heat because she heard something loud and decided that whatever made that sound was not afraid. She was right. I am not afraid of this process. I am not afraid of the home study or the background check or this hearing or the questions you have for me. I will answer every one of them for as long as you need me to, because that child deserves someone who will stay in the room and not leave." He stopped. The ventilation system moved air through the ceiling. Judge Voss looked at the photograph of Caleb. She looked at it for a long moment with an expression that her professional composure was not entirely able to contain. Then she looked at Claire Addison. "Ms. Addison, your assessment." Claire opened her folder. "The home study conducted by Beverly Marsh was comprehensive and returned a favorable determination on all assessed criteria. The residence is appropriate. The applicant's financial situation is stable. The background check returned clean. The psychological evaluation indicated a well-regulated individual with a history of managing significant personal loss without behavioral deterioration." She paused. "In my professional assessment, Mr. Brixton represents an unusually strong candidate for this placement, and I believe the existing bond between him and the child is a significant factor in Ellie's continued recovery and stability." Judge Voss made a note. She removed her glasses and set them on the bench in front of her and looked at Garrett without the mediation of the lenses. "I'd like to speak with Ellie," she said. "Alone. She's been brought in." "She's in the building," Claire said. Ellie had arrived at the courthouse with Della at 9:30, and she had been waiting in a room down the hall with a woman from Claire's office who had been charged with keeping her calm, which Della had reported was not proving to be a significant challenge because Ellie was reading the motorcycle history book for the 4th time and appeared entirely composed. They brought Ellie into the courtroom without Garrett. He waited in the hallway with Douglas, who stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the wall and said nothing, which was exactly what the situation required. Garrett looked at the closed courtroom door. He thought about the yellow room, the 2 coats of paint, the bookshelf with 3 shelves of books selected by a young woman in Knoxville who had understood the assignment. The star comforter, the specific stars of the South Dakota sky that Ellie had looked at through a window during the worst times and used as a destination, a place to send herself when the place she was in was intolerable. He thought about Caleb in the garage. He thought about the questions and the answers and the quality of presence that being with Caleb had required, and that he had given without thinking of it as a gift until it was no longer possible to give. He thought about 7:30 every evening, and the way Ellie's voice sounded when she picked up on the second ring, the slight shift in it from neutral to something warmer, the 2-second recalibration of a person who has confirmed that the thing they were counting on is still there. The courtroom door opened after 22 minutes. The clerk came out and told them they could come back in. Judge Voss was at the bench. Ellie was sitting in a chair to the side of the room, close enough to be present, but positioned as an observer rather than a subject. She was wearing the blue jacket that Della had bought her in September, and she had the motorcycle book in her lap, which suggested that whoever had been keeping her company had allowed her to bring it in, which suggested that whoever that person was had made a good decision. When Garrett came through the door, Ellie looked up. She found his face with the same directness she had used in the ambulance, the same immediate confirmation. Then she looked back at Judge Voss. Judge Voss looked at her notes. She looked at Garrett. She looked at Ellie. "I've spoken with Ellie," she said. "I found her to be a thoughtful and direct young person whose expressed preferences are entirely coherent and well-reasoned." A pause. "She told me something I'd like to share with you, Mr. Brixton, with her permission." Ellie nodded once from her chair, the same transactional nod he knew. "I asked Ellie to tell me about you," Judge Voss said. "She told me that you read books with different voices for each character. She told me that you answer questions. Every question." The judge's voice remained level, but there was something in it that had not been in it before. "And then I asked her if she wanted to live with you. She thought about it for a moment, and she said, 'I walked 12 miles to find him. I don't want to walk anywhere else.'" The ventilation system moved air through the ceiling. Garrett stood very still. "The foster care placement is approved," Judge Voss said, "effective upon completion of the remaining administrative steps which Ms. Addison will coordinate. I expect those to be completed within 30 days. She looked at Ellie. "Do you have anything you want to say?" Ellie looked at Garrett. She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes that had been too large for her face and were growing more proportionate as the face itself filled in, as the body reclaimed itself from the months of systematic deprivation and remembered what it was supposed to be. "Can we go see the horses now?" she asked. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "we can go see the horses." The administrative steps took 26 days. Claire Addison coordinated them with the methodical efficiency that Garrett had observed in her from the beginning, moving through the paperwork and the requirements with the focus of someone who understood that the paperwork was not the point, but was the mechanism through which the point was achieved. Garrett signed what needed to be signed. He completed what needed to be completed. He called Ellie every evening at 7:30 and told her about the progress item by item, because she had asked to be kept informed, and he had learned that keeping her informed was not just a courtesy, but a functional requirement that she processed uncertainty through information, the way most people processed it, through reassurance, and that the two were not the same thing. On a Thursday in the first week of January, Garrett drove Boone's truck north out of Knoxville in the early morning. The Tennessee hills were bare and gray in the winter light, the ridges stripped of their leaves and standing against the sky in the clean skeletal lines that the cold months revealed. He drove through the day, through the state lines, through the changing landscape of the American interior in January, the land growing flatter and colder and more exposed as he went north and west. He arrived at Delafontaine's ranch on County Road 18 in the late afternoon. The sky over South Dakota in January was enormous and pale, the color of old pewter. The light diffused and even without shadows. The land on either side of the county road was flat and open and dormant, the grass pressed down by the cold, the horizon a clean, unbroken line in every direction. He pulled into the ranch driveway and stopped the truck and sat for a moment with the engine running. The ranch house had its lights on warm yellow rectangles against the gray afternoon. Butterscotch was visible in the paddock, standing with her enormous, patient calm near the gate. The two dogs were in the yard, the porch door open. Ellie came out. She was wearing the blue jacket and a pair of boots that Della had bought her when the weather changed, and she was carrying the stuffed rabbit that the hospital had given her the first night, the one she had taken with her from the pediatric ward, and brought to Della's and apparently brought here today, held against her side with one arm while her other arm swung free. She stood on the porch for a moment looking at the truck. Then she ran. She ran with a speed that would not have been possible 4 months ago. The speed of a body that had been restored to itself, that had received what it needed, and had used it to become what it was supposed to be. She covered the distance from the porch to the truck in a straight line, her boots hitting the gravel drive, her jacket flying open, the rabbit held tight against her side. Garrett was out of the truck by the time she reached him. He went down on one knee in the gravel, and she hit him with the full momentum of her running, and he caught her both arms lifting her up. She was heavier than she had been in the ambulance, substantially heavier. The weight of a child who had been fed consistently for 4 months, who had slept without fear for 4 months, who had stood in a paddock with a Palomino horse and pressed her face into warm animal fur and allowed herself to be exactly 7 years old. She wrapped her arms around his neck. She pressed her face into his shoulder. He held on. Della was standing on the porch. He could see her over Ellie's shoulder, her arms crossed against the January cold, her expression the one that people had when they were watching something they had waited to see, and it was exactly what they had hoped for. The land stretched out in every direction, flat and pale and enormous. The sky above it was the same color as the day they had met, the same diffuse light, though when they had met it had been summer and burning, and everything had been different. The sky in South Dakota was like that, the same quality of immensity, regardless of the season, the same reminder that the things that happened beneath it happened at a specific scale, that a man and a child in a gravel driveway in January were small against that sky, but not insignificant, not erased by the largeness of it, but held by it, the way small things were held by large things, when the large things were doing what they were supposed to do. Ellie pulled back far enough to look at his face. She had the rabbit in one hand between them, its worn ear pressed against his chest. Her eyes were the gray-blue he knew, clear and direct, and assessing, doing the same rapid cataloging she always did, checking that the information matched the expectation. It matched. "The room is yellow," he said. "2 coats." "I know," she said. "You told me." "There are books." "I know, you told me about every one." "The comforter has stars." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change dramatically. It did not need to. The change was internal, visible in the eyes and the settling of her face, into something that was not the careful watchfulness she had been practicing for years, but something different. Something that did not have a word for it in the language of 7-year-olds, though the language of adults would have called it the look of someone who has arrived somewhere. "South Dakota stars?" she asked. "South Dakota stars," he said. She put her face back against his shoulder. He stood up with her and held her in the January cold and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in 3 years. A loosening, a release of pressure in a structure that had been under load for so long that the load had started to feel like the natural state of the material. It did not hurt. It was not grief leaving, because grief did not leave. It simply changed configuration, the flood becoming a river, becoming a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a disaster. It was something coming back, some quality of presence that had been offline since the phone call in November 3 years ago, returning now through the simple mechanism of a child's arms around his neck in a gravel driveway in South Dakota in January. He blinked hard against the cold. "I walked toward the loud sound," Ellie said into his shoulder. Her voice was muffled by the leather of his vest. "And I found you." He could not speak. He held her instead, which was the same thing. Della came down from the porch with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him over Ellie's head and said nothing, because Della Fontaine was a woman who understood that some moments required witnesses and not words, that the job of a witness was to be present and to see and to allow the thing to be what it was. They stood like that in the driveway, the 3 of them, while Butterscotch moved along the paddock fence with her unhurried circuit, and the 2 dogs investigated the truck tires with the serious attention of dogs who took their investigative responsibilities at face value, and the January sky held its enormous pale light over everything without preference or comment. After a while, Ellie said, still from her position against his shoulder, Does your house have a porch? It does, Garrett said. Can you see the stars from the porch? On a clear night, the ridge blocks some of the north, but the south is open. She considered this. Della's porch, you can see almost everything, she said. But that's okay. Different skies. Different skies, he agreed. She lifted her head and looked at him with the expression she had when she was turning something over, examining it from the multiple angles she brought to most things. Caleb, she said, did he ever sit on the porch with you? Garrett looked at her. The question landed in him the way Ellie's question sometimes landed without warning, reaching through whatever he had arranged around himself and touching something directly. In the summer, he said, when it was warm enough, he'd sit out there after dinner and we'd listen to the tree frogs. Tree frogs, she repeated as if cataloging this. Tennessee has a lot of them. Get loud in July. She nodded slowly, processing. Then, I've never heard tree frogs. You will, he said. By July. She looked at him for another moment, and then something in her face did the thing. It sometimes did, the thing that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory, a shift in the arrangement of her features that meant she had decided something was acceptable. Okay, she said. She put her face back against his shoulder one more time, and then she wriggled down from his arms and stood in the gravel and took his hand, which was something she had not done before, a different gesture than the vest, more deliberate, and she looked up at him. Can we go inside, she said. It's cold. Yeah, he said. Let's go inside. They walked up the porch steps and through Della's front door into the warm interior of the ranch house, where the kitchen smelled of coffee and something baking and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in carefully for a long time. Ellie went immediately to the table where her motorcycle book was sitting open to a page she had been reading, and she sat down and looked at it, and then looked up at Garrett. This chapter is about the evolution of the V-twin engine, she said. There are things I don't understand. Garrett took off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the door. He pulled out the chair across the table from her and sat down. Show me what you don't understand, he said. She turned the book around so he could see it. She pointed to a diagram. She asked her question. It was a good question, specific and logical, the product of someone who had read carefully and identified precisely where the explanation had outpaced her existing knowledge. He answered it completely. She asked a follow-up question. He answered that too. Outside, the South Dakota sky continued its enormous, indifferent business of being the sky, and somewhere in it, the stars were already there waiting for the light to go so they could be seen. In July in Tennessee, the tree frogs would be loud enough to hear from the porch, and a girl who had walked 12 miles through August heat to find something loud enough to trust would sit in the evening and listen to them and ask questions, and every one of them would be answered. The questions and the answers, the voices in the books, the yellow room at the end of the hall, the comforter with the South Dakota stars, the bookshelves full and waiting, all of it there, all of it ready. The only thing that had been missing was a direction to walk toward, and she had found that on her own at 7 years old on bare feet with 2 cracked ribs in 103 degrees of August heat, reasoning her way through the available logic with the fierce and methodical clarity of someone who understood that the decision she made in that moment was the most important decision she had ever been required to make. Loud things were not afraid. Therefore, loud things might be safe. Therefore, she had walked toward the loudest thing she could find. She had been right. And Garrett Brixton, 44 years old, former Marine owner of a motorcycle repair shop in Knoxville, Tennessee, member of the Iron Wolves MC, for 15 years, father of a boy named Caleb, who had loved engines and asked questions and taught his father how to do the voices right, sat across a kitchen table from a 7-year-old girl who was pointing at a diagram and asking him to explain something she did not yet understand. He leaned forward. He looked at the diagram. He began to explain.